In the belly of the world's busiest city, 1,000 trains move like silver blood through concrete veins. To the commuters, the subway is a convenience. To Patch, a three-legged calico, it is a battlefield. They called her a stray, a shadow to be cleared from the tracks. But when a runaway ghost train sped toward a station packed with families, and the digital brakes stayed dead, the city's life rested on the paws of the cat who knew the tunnels better than the engineers. This is the story of the 13th rail. The shadow of the subterranean. In the belly of the metropolis, 200 feet below the neon glitz of the surface, lies a world of eternal twilight. Here, the air is thick with the scent of wet concrete, ozone, and the metallic dust of 1,000 grinding wheels. This is the labyrinth, the veins of the city where silver trains pulse like blood through narrow arteries. It is a place of absolute darkness, broken only by the rhythmic flash of signal lights and the occasional spark of a third rail. Among the rust and the shadows lived Patch. She was a calico of jagged edges and sharp intelligence, her fur a chaotic map of orange, black, and white. She was a survivor of the tunnel's unforgiving physics, having lost her left hind leg to a high-speed commuter train years ago. Instead of letting the injury break her, she had adapted, developing a rhythmic, three-legged gallop that allowed her to navigate the treacherous catwalks and narrow ledges with the grace of a phantom. Patch resided in what the engineers called the dead ends, a series of forgotten tunnels from a bygone era that had been sealed off from the public. These were her cathedrals, filled with the skeletons of old steam engines and the steady drip of condensation from the city's plumbing above. To the Transit Authority, she was a biological anomaly, a track nuisance that appeared on motion sensors only to vanish before the traps could be set. The guardian of the 13th rail. The commuters on the platforms above had no idea she existed. To them, the subway was a mere convenience, a way to get from point A to point B while staring at their glowing screens. They never looked down into the dark abyss beyond the platform edge, where Patch watched them with glowing, mismatched eyes. She saw their hurry, their exhaustion, and their complete disconnection from the roaring machine that carried them. But Patch was deeply connected to the machine. She knew the secret language of the tunnels, the way the air pushed forward before a train arrived, the high-pitched hum of the wires when the grid was overloaded, and the subtle shifting of the rats when a storm was brewing on the surface. She was a creature of the infrastructure, a living part of the city's foundation that everyone used but no one acknowledged. She didn't ask for a place in the world of light. She was content in her kingdom of iron, patrolling the 13th rail, a ghost track that ran alongside the main lines. She was the silent witness to the city's secrets, a small, limping shadow that kept watch over the dark. She was a stray in name, but in the silence of the subterranean, she was the only soul that was truly home. The sound of the steel. The only human who ever truly saw Patch was Elias. A track walker with silver hair and hands calloused by 40 years of labor, Elias was a man who preferred the company of echoes to the noise of the surface. His job was the most dangerous in the system, inspecting the structural integrity of the tracks during the quiet hours between 2 o'clock and 4 a.m. He moved with a heavy lantern and a slow, deliberate pace, a solitary monk in a cathedral of concrete. Their friendship began not with a touch, but with a tribute. One winter night, Elias found Patch shivering on a signal box, her fur matted with frozen condensation. Instead of shooing her away, he opened a tin of expensive sardines and left it on a clean cloth. He didn't try to pet her, he simply sat 5 feet away and ate his own sandwich in silence. It was a gesture of equality that Patch recognized instantly. From that night on, they became the only two residents of the 3 a.m. shift. Patch would wait for the rhythmic clack-clack of Elias's inspection hammer against the rails. She would appear from the rafters, her calico coat a blur in the dim light of his lantern. Elias would talk to her about the silver bullet trains, the politics of the transit board, and the wife he had lost a decade ago. He treated her not as a stray, but as a colleague. Elias called her Patch because of her fur, but also because he felt they were both patched together by life's hardships. He saw his own scars reflected in her missing leg and her notched ears. He would often leave small gifts near Signal Box 04, a scrap of wool, a catnip toy, or a piece of chicken. In return, Patch would lead him away from loose cables or points where the rats had chewed through the insulation. The subterranean world was a lonely one, but together they made it a sanctuary. The roaring of the distant express trains was their background music, and the smell of grease was their perfume. Elias knew that if he ever fell or got trapped, the calico would be the only one to know. Patch knew that as long as the old man walked the tracks, she would never be truly hungry. In the eyes of the city, they were both obsolete, a man replaced by automated sensors and a cat that shouldn't be there. But in the dark, they were essential. They were the human and animal guardians of the 13th rail, maintaining a balance that the digital systems above couldn't understand. They were a secret society of two, anchored by a tin of sardines and a mutual respect for the steel. The ghost in the system. The night of the disaster began with a logic surge. At the Central Transit Hub, a new AI-driven routing software suffered a catastrophic feedback loop. To the digital brain of the system, a ghost train appeared on the monitors. A phantom data point that triggered an emergency bypass. The system, attempting to correct itself, inadvertently sent a full-throttle command to the Silver Bullet Express, a high-speed automated train currently carrying 300 passengers. The Silver Bullet was the pride of the city, a pilotless marvel of engineering. But as the software glitched, the train's internal safety locks disengaged. It began to accelerate, bypassing its scheduled stops at the residential districts. The digital brakes were locked in the off position by the surge, and the communication lines between the train and the hub were severed. The train was now a 500-ton bullet of steel screaming through the dark at 110 miles per hour. 3 miles ahead, Elias and his maintenance crew were working in the heart of Tunnel 7. They were replacing a cracked sleeper, a task that required heavy jackhammers and floodlights. The noise was deafening, a localized thunder that drowned out everything else. Because the transit hub's communication was dead, the crew's handheld radios were emitting nothing but static. They had no idea that a silent, high-speed death was barreling toward them. The tunnel was a death trap. The curve of Tunnel 7 was too sharp to see more than 100 yards ahead, and the maintenance floodlights were pointed toward the ground, blinding the workers to the track ahead. The crew worked with the confidence of men who believed the quiet hours were protected by the automated system. They were standing directly in the path of the Silver Bullet, completely oblivious to the approaching wind. Above them, in the control rooms, engineers scrambled and shouted, but their screens were frozen. They watched helplessly as the data point showed the Silver Bullet entering Tunnel 7. They knew the physics, the train would reach the maintenance site in less than 90 seconds. There was no way to warn the men, no way to cut the power from the surface, and no way to stop the momentum of the steel beast. The air in the tunnel began to change, the pressure building as the train pushed a wall of atmosphere ahead of it. But to the workers, it just felt like a draft from the ventilation fans. They continued their work, the sparks from their saws flying into the air, creating a curtain of light that obscured the darkness. The stage was set for a tragedy that would be written in the city's history books for decades. The vibration of death. Patch was a mile away from the crew, perched on the high ledge of Signal Box 04. She felt the disaster long before the humans did. She pressed her chest against the cold concrete and felt a frequency that made her fur stand on end. It was a rhythmic, violent shudder in the ground, a killing vibration. She had felt this once before, on the night the metal had claimed her leg. It was the sound of a train that wasn't stopping. Her instinct screamed at her to flee into the deep vents where the noise couldn't reach. But she looked down the tunnel toward the flicker of the maintenance lights. She could see Elias, his back turned to the danger, leaning over a rail with his wrench. She let out a long, haunting howl that was lost in the roar of the jackhammers. She knew that in 60 seconds, the man who gave her sardines would be nothing but a memory. Patch leaped from the ledge, her 3 legs working with a frantic, desperate energy. She didn't run away from the train, she ran toward it, then veered onto the main line, sprinting toward the maintenance crew. The wind was picking up now, a hot, oily gale that pushed against her small frame. She reached the first worker and bit into his pant leg, pulling with all her might. He kicked her away, thinking she was a stray rat. She didn't give up. She ran to Elias, jumping onto his shoulders and digging her claws into his heavy work jacket. He looked up, startled, and saw the terror in the cat's mismatched eyes. For a second, the noise of the jackhammers seemed to fade, and he heard it, the low-frequency growl of the tracks. He looked at Patch, then at the curve of the tunnel where the darkness was suddenly beginning to glow with a terrifying, white light. "Get off the tracks!" Elias screamed, his voice barely audible. He lunged for the emergency siren, but the wires had been cut by the same surge that disabled the train. The crew looked up, confused, as the wind suddenly became a hurricane. They saw the white light of the silver bullet rounding the curve, a predatory eye emerging from the dark. They had seconds to live, and the nearest safety alcove was 50 yards away. Patch knew that running wouldn't be enough. The train was moving too fast, the vacuum created by its passage would suck the men under the wheels even if they were off the rails. The only way to save them was to kill the power to the third rail, which would trigger the train's mechanical deadman brakes. But the manual switch was back at signal box 04, and it was protected by a high-frequency sonic guard designed to keep biological life away. Chapter 5: The Sacrifice at the Signal Box. Patch turned and sprinted back towards signal box 04. She was running against the wind now, the air pressure of the approaching train trying to pin her to the wall. As she approached the box, the sonic sentry kicked in, a high-pitched, invisible wall of sound that felt like hot needles being driven into her ears. Most animals would have collapsed in agony, their nervous systems overwhelmed by the frequency. Patch stumbled, her vision blurring. The sound was a physical weight, a scream that only she could hear, designed to protect the high-voltage equipment from pests. She crawled on her belly, her claws dragging through the grit of the tunnel floor. She could see the heavy iron lever of the manual trip switch just 3 feet away. Above it, the red light of the signal box pulsed like a dying heart. Behind her, the silver bullet was a wall of thunder. The headlights illuminated the entire tunnel, turning the grey concrete into a blinding, sterile white. Patch reached the base of the box and leaped. The sonic guard intensified, a wave of nausea washing over her, but she caught the iron handle with her front paws. She hung there, her small body dangling over the high-voltage 13th rail, her teeth bared in a silent snarl of pain. She used the only thing she had, her weight. She swung her body back and forth, the copper wire of the switch groaning under the strain. With a final, heroic heave, she slammed her weight downward. Clack! The lever moved. A massive blue arc of electricity erupted from the box as the circuit was broken. The surge threw Patch backward into the darkness, her fur singed and her heart stuttering from the shock. The effect on the silver bullet was instantaneous. With the third rail dead, the train's failsafe engaged. The massive electromagnet brakes beneath the cars slammed onto the rails with a shriek of tortured metal. A curtain of sparks, 20 feet high, erupted from the wheels, illuminating the tunnel like a 4th of July celebration. The train groaned, its internal structure twisting under the sudden deceleration. The silver bullet came to a halt just 15 feet from the maintenance crew. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the ticking of cooling metal and the frantic breathing of the men. They stood in the shadows of the massive train, looking at the dead lights and the smoke, realizing they were alive because of a sound they hadn't even heard. Elias didn't look at the train, he ran towards signal box 04. The hero of the underground. Elias found Patch in the narrow gap between the wall and the 13th rail. She was a small, scorched heap of calico fur, her breathing shallow and her eyes closed. He knelt in the soot, his heavy flashlight trembling as he checked for a pulse. "Don't you go," he whispered, his voice thick with a grief he hadn't felt in years. "Not today, you stubborn ghost." He scooped her up, wrapping her in his work jacket, and ran for the surface. The story of the cat of Tunnel 7 broke the city's heart. The data logs showed the manual trip switch had been thrown at the exact microsecond needed to stop the train. When the security footage from the signal box was recovered, it showed a 3-legged cat flying through a wall of sparks to pull a lever that no human could have reached in time. The track nuisance had saved 300 passengers and a crew of 5. Patch spent 3 weeks in the city's most advanced veterinary hospital. Her medical bills were paid by a crowdfunding campaign that raised $500,000 in 24 hours. People who had never stepped foot in a subway station sent flowers, sardines, and hand-knitted blankets. The city that had ignored her for years was now obsessed with her recovery, watching her vitals monitor on the morning news. But Patch didn't care for the fame. When she was finally discharged, she didn't go back to the tunnels. The Transit Authority created a new position, safety consultant of the 13th Rail. They built her a sun-drenched office in the glass-walled headquarters overlooking the city. She had a custom-made climbing tree that mimicked the rafters of the subway and a permanent supply of fresh sashimi. Elias retired shortly after, but he didn't go far. He was hired as the official caretaker for the transit mascot. Every day at 3 p.m., he sits in the office with Patch, sharing a sandwich and talking about the old days in the dark. Patch still has a slight limp, and her fur is a bit thinner. Where the sparks bit her, but her eyes are full of a calm, contented light. She is no longer a shadow, she is the soul of the city. Today, if you ride the Silver Bullet through Tunnel 7, you might notice a small bronze plaque on Signal Box 04. It doesn't have a long speech or a list of names. It simply features the silhouette of a three-legged cat and the words, "She felt the vibration. She pulled the lever. She saved us all." It is a reminder to the thousands of people rushing above that sometimes, the greatest heroes are the ones we never even see. Patch was a broken stray in a world of perfect machines, but when the system failed, her heart was the only thing that didn't glitch. She proved that being a different is often what makes you a hero. If Patch's sacrifice brought a tear to your eye, hit that like button right now. Subscribe to Paws that saved lives for more cinematic stories of animal courage. Comment Ghost below if you believe that animals see the dangers we are too busy to notice.